The Vatican's archives don't hide magic or monsters, they hide the truth. The trial records, the secret letters, and the diplomatic deals that shape history. These are the top 10 darkest secrets, finally revealed. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History knows them as the Knights Templar. For nearly 200 years, they were the most powerful and feared institution in Christendom, a holy order of warrior monks who answered to no king, only to the Pope himself. Born from the ashes of the First Crusade, their sacred duty was to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. But they became much more than that. They became the world's first multinational corporation, pioneering a system of banking that allowed pilgrims to deposit assets in London and withdraw them in Jerusalem. Their wealth became legendary, their power absolute, and their secrecy impenetrable. And then, in the blink of an eye, they vanished. The dark secret of how and why is not a tale of heresy, but a cold, calculated story of greed and political betrayal, the proof of which lay buried in the Vatican's archives for 700 years. The man who would bring them down was not a sultan, but a king. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. By the dawn of the 14th century, Philip was the most powerful monarch in Europe, but he was also catastrophically in debt, and a significant portion of that debt was owed to the Templars themselves. He saw their vast network of castles, farms, and financial power not as a holy order, but as a state within his state, an intolerable threat to his own authority. He needed their wealth, and he devised a plan of shocking brutality and cunning to get it. He would accuse the untouchable holy warriors of the one crime that could destroy them completely: heresy. On Friday the 13th of October, in the year 1307, King Philip's men launched a coordinated pre-dawn raid across all of France. Every Templar, from the highest commander to the lowest brother, was arrested. The charges were designed to incite maximum public outrage, denying Christ, spitting on the cross during secret initiation rites, worshipping a demonic idol in the form of a severed head named Baphomet, and engaging in institutionalized homosexuality. And a horrific, systematic torture at the hands of Philip's inquisitors, many knights confessed to these incredible sins. The confessions were a propaganda masterpiece, sealing the Templars' doom in the public eye. But one man remained unconvinced: Pope Clement V. While the Pope was politically weak and effectively controlled by the French crown, he was still the only man with the authority to dissolve a holy order. He launched his own investigation, and the records of that secret papal inquiry are what make this one of the Vatican's greatest secrets. For centuries, the official story was that the Pope investigated and found the Templars guilty, but in the year 2001, a historian named Barbara Frail was digging through the archives and found a misfiled document. It was known as the Chinon Parchment. This document was the long-lost record of the Pope's personal hearing with the highest leaders of the Knights Templar, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. After they explained that their confessions had been extracted only through relentless torture, the parchment reveals the stunning truth. Pope Clement V formally absolved the Templar leadership of heresy. He believed they were not heretics. He accepted that some rituals may have been misguided or sinful, but he found no evidence of apostasy. The Pope's secret plan was to reform the order and keep it alive. But King Philip would not be denied his prize. He used political threats, military pressure, and the public scandal fueled by the forced confessions to corner the Pope. Trapped and fearing a schism that could tear the Church apart, Pope Clement made a devastating choice. In the year 1312, he issued a papal bull that officially dissolved the Knights Templar. Crucially, the bull did not condemn them for heresy. Instead, the Pope stated he was dissolving the order for the good of the Church because their reputation had been too gravely damaged by the scandal. It was a political execution. The dark secret, hidden on the Chinon parchment, is that the Vatican knew the Templars were innocent of the central charge against them, but sacrificed the Holy Order to appease a greedy and powerful king. The trial of the Knights Templar was not a pursuit of justice. It was the medieval world's most brutal and successful corporate takeover. There are documents in the Vatican archives that did not just record history, they created it. They are not records of trials or confessions, but decrees that drew lines across oceans, sanctioned the conquest of continents, and gave divine permission for the subjugation of millions. This is the story of the Doctrine of Discovery, a series of papal bulls from the 15th century that provided the legal and theological justification for the entire colonial era. The dark secret they contain is not hidden in code, but written in plain Latin, a church-sanctioned framework for Christian European powers to seize lands and dominate non-Christian peoples, the consequences of which still haunt the world today. The year was 1493. Christopher Columbus had just returned from his first voyage, claiming to have found a new route to the Indies and encountering lands and peoples previously unknown to Europe. His patrons, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, needed to secure their claim against their primary rival, Portugal. To do this, they turned to the only authority they considered to be above any king, the Pope. At the time, the papacy was held by Alexander VI, a politically ambitious and notoriously corrupt figure from the Spanish Borgia family. In a series of bulls, most famously one called Inter Caetera, Pope Alexander acted as a global arbiter. He drew an imaginary line of longitude down the Atlantic Ocean, declaring that all newly discovered lands to the west of the line belonged to Spain, and those to the east, to Portugal. But the bull did much more than divide the world between two kingdoms. It established a terrifying legal and religious principle. It granted these lands to Spain on the explicit condition that their barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. The document assumes that any land not inhabited by Christians was empty or terra nullius, nobody's land, and therefore available to be claimed by Christian rulers. It gave them the right to invade, search out, capture, vanquish and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. The dark secret is this: the Doctrine of Discovery was not a mere political treaty, it was a theological license for conquest. It explicitly denied the humanity and sovereignty of indigenous peoples, defining them as objects to be converted or eliminated. This was not an obscure, forgotten decree. For the next 400 years, this doctrine became the bedrock of international law among colonial powers. It was the justification used by conquistadors as they decimated the Aztec and Inca empires. It was the legal theory that allowed settlers to drive Native American tribes from their ancestral homes, arguing that the tribes had no legitimate title to the land because they were not Christians. The impact was catastrophic, leading to centuries of war, displacement, cultural destruction, and the transatlantic slave trade, all under the veneer of a divine mandate issued from the heart of the Vatican. The documents in the archive prove that the age of colonialism was not an unfortunate accident of history. It was a project that began with explicit papal authorization. For centuries, the Church did little to address this legacy, until finally, in the year 2023, the Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine, acknowledging that these papal bulls were manipulated for political purposes by competing colonial powers, and that they do not reflect the equal dignity and rights of indigenous peoples. It was a confession that took over 500 years to make. On the last day of October in the year 1517, a German theology professor named Martin Luther nailed a document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. That document, his 95 Theses, was not a declaration of war, but a plea for debate. It was a challenge to a practice he saw as a grotesque corruption of faith, the selling of indulgences. These were certificates, officially sanctioned by the Church, that promised to reduce the amount of punishment one had to undergo for their sins in the afterlife. In Germany, the money from these sales was being used to fund the opulent reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. To Luther, it was the spiritual equivalent of a protection racket. He had no idea he was about to ignite a fire that would shatter Western Christendom forever. The Vatican Archives tell the story not of a righteous church casting out a heretic, but of a powerful, bureaucratic institution so blinded by money and pride that it catastrophically mishandled a call for reform, and in doing so, broke its own world in two. When news of Luther's 95 Theses reached Rome, the reaction was not alarm but dismissal. The Pope at the time was Leo X, a man from the vastly wealthy and powerful Medici family. The letters and reports in the Vatican Archives show that he and his advisors initially saw Luther as a minor nuisance, a drunken German, in the Pope's own supposed words, who will feel differently when he is sober. They saw it as a petty squabble between rival monastic orders. What they failed to grasp was the deep simmering resentment across Germany against the financial and political power of Rome. Luther's arguments against indulgences were not just theological. They were a lightning rod for a growing German nationalism. He was saying what millions of people already felt, that the Church was more interested in their money than their souls. The Vatican dispatched theologians and cardinals to debate Luther, to force him to recant. But these confrontations only pushed him to more radical conclusions. He began to question not just indulgences, but the very authority of the Pope himself, arguing that Scripture alone was the ultimate source of Christian truth. The debate was no longer about money. It was about the foundation of power in the Church. The dark secret revealed by the archival records is the story of a missed opportunity. There were moments when reconciliation was possible, when the Church could have addressed the legitimate criticisms of corruption and reformed itself from within. But pride and politics stood in the way. The point of no return came in the year 1520. Pope Leo X issued a papal bull known as Exsurge Domine. Its opening words are chilling. "Arise, O Lord, and judge your own cause. A wild boar has invaded your vineyard." The bull listed 41 of Luther's supposed errors and gave him 60 days to travel to Rome and recant, or face excommunication. It was a declaration of war. Luther's response was one of the most defiant acts in history. In a public gathering in Wittenberg, he burned the papal bull. The break was now complete. On January 3, 1521, the Pope issued another bull, formally declaring Martin Luther a heretic and casting him out of the Catholic Church. But it was too late. Luther was now a national hero, protected by powerful German princes who saw a political opportunity to break free from Rome's control. The excommunication, intended to crush one man, instead created a permanent schism. The documents in the Vatican Archive tell the story of this fatal miscalculation, proving that the Protestant Reformation was not inevitable. It was the direct result of a church that chose power over reform, and condemnation over dialogue. Of all the secrets held within the Vatican's archives, none have come to define the supposed war between faith and science more than the trial of Galileo Galilei. The story is famous. A brilliant astronomer, armed with a new invention called the telescope, proves the Earth revolves around the Sun, only to be condemned as a heretic by a dogmatic, backwards church. It is the ultimate parable of reason versus superstition, but the full, unedited trial records, held in the archive for centuries, tell a different story. They reveal a secret that is far more human and far more tragic. The downfall of Galileo was not a simple battle of ideas, it was a perfect storm of intellectual pride, personal betrayal, political intrigue, and the fatal misuse of a single questionable document to destroy a man's career and silence a truth that could no longer be contained. In the early 1600s, Galileo Galilei turned his telescope to the heavens and shattered the known universe. He discovered mountains on the moon, saw that Jupiter had its own orbiting moons, and observed the phases of Venus. These discoveries provided powerful observable evidence for a theory proposed decades earlier by Nicolaus Copernicus, that the Earth was not the center of creation, but just another planet orbiting the Sun. This heliocentric model directly contradicted the established science of the day, which was based on the ancient Greek model of an Earth-centered universe. More dangerously, it contradicted the literal interpretation of certain passages of Scripture. In the year 1616, the Holy Office of the Inquisition investigated the matter and declared the Copernican theory to be foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical. Galileo was formally warned by the powerful Cardinal Bellarmine. He was not to hold, teach, or defend the heliocentric theory in any way. For years, Galileo remained publicly silent. But everything changed when a new pope was elected, Pope Urban VIII. The new pope was a great admirer of arts and science, and, more importantly, he was a personal friend of Galileo. Believing he now had protection at the highest level, Galileo wrote his masterpiece, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. To navigate the Church's decree, he framed the book as a neutral debate between three characters, but his attempt at subtlety was his undoing. The character arguing for the Church's earth-centered view was named Simplicio, or Simpleton, and he was consistently portrayed as a bumbling fool. When the book was published, Pope Urban VIII was enraged. He felt that Galileo had not only defied the Church's order, but had personally mocked him, putting the Pope's own arguments into the mouth of a fool. He felt betrayed. This is where the archival secret lies. When Galileo was summoned before the Inquisition in 1633, the prosecution produced a document from the 1616 meeting that no one had seen before. It was an unsigned, unwitnessed injunction that was far stricter than the warning Galileo knew he'd received. This document claimed Galileo was forbidden from even discussing the theory at all. Historians still debate whether this document was a forgery, a clerical error, or a threat that was never formally served, but it became the prosecution's smoking gun. They now had a legal instrument to prove Galileo had willfully disobeyed a direct, personal order of the Inquisition. The trial was no longer about astronomy, it was about obedience. The unedited records show the Pope's personal fury driving the process, demanding a harsh verdict to make an example of his former friend. Faced with the threat of torture, the nearly 70-year-old Galileo knelt before the cardinals and recanted. He was forced to abjure, curse, and detest the truth that the earth moves. He was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. The secret of the trial is not that the Church was ignorant of science. It's that a great scientific mind was crushed in a vice of personal animosity, bureaucratic power, and a legal trap sprung with a mysterious piece of paper from the archives. The history of the papacy contains moments of profound faith and moments of shocking corruption, but nothing compares to its most bizarre, most macabre, and most grotesque episode. It is a secret so strange, it sounds like a fever dream. But the historical records in the Vatican Archives confirm it is horrifyingly true. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod of the year 897, a moment in history when a reigning pope exhumed the rotting corpse of his predecessor, dressed it in sacred papal vestments, propped it up on a throne, and put the dead man on trial. It is a story that reveals the absolute depths of political savagery that once consumed the throne of St. Peter, a time when the papacy was not a spiritual office, but a prize to be won through conspiracy, murder, and in this case, the desecration of the dead. To understand how this could happen, we must travel back to the late 9th century, a period of chaos in Rome known as the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age. The papacy was controlled by warring aristocratic families who treated the position as their personal property. Popes were installed, deposed, and often murdered with terrifying speed. Our story centers on two men. The first is Pope Formosus, the corpse. Before becoming pope, he had made powerful enemies in the Italian political landscape by aligning himself with foreign powers against a dominant local dynasty. The second man is Pope Stephen VI, the accuser. Stephen was a member of the very family that Formosus had opposed. He was a puppet pope, installed for one single vindictive purpose, to destroy the legacy of his dead rival. 9 months after Pope Formosus had died and been buried, Pope Stephen ordered his body to be dug up. The corpse, already in a state of decay, was brought to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of Rome. There it was clothed in the full, majestic robes of the papacy and placed upon a throne to face its accuser. Pope Stephen screamed questions at the silent, decaying body, leveling charges of perjury and violating canon law. A terrified young deacon was forced to stand beside the corpse, tasked with speaking on its behalf, his answers trembling and incoherent. The trial was a sham, a grotesque piece of political theater. The real goal was not justice, but erasure. Unsurprisingly, the dead pope was found guilty. The verdict was swift and brutal. All of the acts and ordinations performed by Formosus during his reign were declared null and void. This was the true purpose of the trial. It instantly invalidated the careers of countless priests and bishops that Formosus had appointed, creating a power vacuum that Pope Stephen and his political masters could fill with their own loyal allies. The ghoulish spectacle was not over. The corpse was stripped of its holy garments. The 3 fingers on its right hand, the fingers used to give the papal blessing, were hacked off with an axe. The body was then tied to a rope, dragged through the jeering streets of Rome, and unceremoniously thrown into the Tiber River. The secret of the Cadaver Synod is not just that this horrific event occurred, but what it represented: the absolute fusion of political vengeance and holy office. It was a terrifying demonstration that in the fight for power in medieval Rome, not even death could provide a sanctuary from your enemies. The New Testament. To billions of Christians, its 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the unshakable foundation of their faith, the divinely inspired and authoritative accounts of the life of Jesus Christ. For nearly 2,000 years, the Church has presented this collection as complete and final. But the archives of the Vatican and the sands of Egypt tell a different story. They tell of a time when Christianity was a chaotic explosion of different beliefs, with dozens of Gospels circulating, each offering a radically different vision of Jesus and his message. The dark secret is not that these other Gospels existed, but the story of the systematic, century-long battle waged by the early Church to hunt them down, declare them heretical, and erase them from history. This was not a simple process of historical curation. It was a fight for the very soul of a new religion, a campaign to forge a single, unified orthodoxy by destroying all competing versions of the truth. The documents that survived this purge offer a stunning glimpse into the Christianities that could have been. In the year 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a local farmer stumbled upon a sealed jar containing a collection of ancient texts. These were the Lost Books, a library of so-called Gnostic writings that had been buried for 1,600 years to hide them from church authorities. Among them were Gospels attributed to Thomas, to Philip, and even a text named the Gospel of Truth. These were the very books that early church fathers like Irenaeus of Lyons had railed against in the 2nd century, condemning them as the wicked fabrications of heretics. For the first time in modern history, the world could read the forbidden scriptures, and what they contained was explosive. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, is not a narrative of Jesus' life and death, but a collection of 114 secret sayings. It portrays a Jesus who is not a savior who dies for the world's sins, but a mystical guide who teaches that the kingdom of God is already present, hidden within each person. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene presents her not as a repentant sinner, but as Jesus' most beloved disciple, entrusted with secret knowledge that infuriated the male apostles, particularly Peter, the symbolic rock upon which the church was built. These texts challenge the very hierarchy and core theology of the institution that was becoming the Roman Catholic Church. The fight against these alternative Christianities was a war of ideas, and the records of this conflict are a key part of the Vatican's archival history. The early church fathers understood that to control the faith, they had to control the story. They established a canon, a definitive list of approved books, and everything else was declared anathema. They argued that there could only be 4 Gospels. Just as there were 4 corners of the earth and 4 winds of heaven, this process was not about discovering the most historically accurate texts. It was about choosing the texts that best supported the structure of the growing church, its bishops, its priests, its sacraments, and its central message of salvation through the death and resurrection of a divine Christ. The Gospels that portrayed Jesus as a human mystic, that empowered women, or that suggested salvation could be found through personal enlightenment rather than through the church, were deemed a mortal threat. The secret of the archives is the record of this deliberate choice, the creation of a single Christian narrative by declaring all others to be heresy. It was a victory won not just by theological argument, but by the power to decide which books would be copied and preserved, and which would be burned and buried. In the spring of 1917, as the Great War slaughtered a generation of European men, 3 young shepherd children in the remote village of Fatima, Portugal, claimed to have seen a vision of the Virgin Mary. Over a series of 6 apparitions, the Lady, as they called her, entrusted them with a message containing 3 distinct parts: a prophetic warning for humanity known as the Three Secrets of Fatima. The first two secrets were revealed decades later and were interpreted as a terrifying vision of hell and a prophecy of the end of the First World War and the coming of an even worse conflict if humanity did not repent. The prophecy also called for the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, warning that if this was not done, the nation would spread its errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. But it was the third secret that would become one of the most agonizing and controversial mysteries in the modern history of the Vatican. The last surviving visionary, Lucia dos Santos, wrote the secret down in 1944, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it to the Vatican with the explicit instruction from the Virgin Mary that it was not to be revealed to the world until 1960. As the year 1960 approached, anticipation among Catholics around the globe reached a fever pitch. Believers expected a revelation of world-shattering importance. Many were certain it predicted a nuclear apocalypse, the final confrontation between the West and the Soviets. Others feared it contained a warning of a great apostasy, a spiritual cancer that would rot the Church from within. January of 1960 came and went. Then the entire year passed. The Vatican remained silent. Pope John XXIII had read the secret and, according to his advisors, decided it was not for their time, placing it back in the archives. His successor, Pope Paul VI, also read it and kept it hidden. This decision to defy the Virgin Mary's supposed command and withhold the secret created a crisis of faith and a breeding ground for conspiracy. For 40 years, the Vatican's silence was deafening. An entire subculture of radical Fatima devotees emerged, convinced that the Vatican itself was compromised, that a cabal of communists or Freemasons had infiltrated the Holy See and were suppressing the secret because it exposed their plot. They accused the popes of cowardice and disobedience. The secret of Fatima became a symbol of a church hierarchy that no longer trusted its own flock with the truth. The dark secret, locked in the archive, was not just the content of a letter, but the Vatican's reason for hiding it, a decision that caused immeasurable spiritual anxiety and damage to its own authority. Finally, in the year 2000, Pope John Paul II, himself a man with a deep devotion to Fatima, who credited the Virgin with saving his life during an assassination attempt in 1981, decided to end the speculation. The Vatican published the full text of the third secret. It described a terrifying vision. A bishop, dressed in white, who the children believed was the Pope, walking through a half-ruined city filled with corpses. He climbs a steep mountain and, at the top, kneels before a large wooden cross, where he is killed by a group of soldiers firing bullets and arrows. The official interpretation, presented by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, was that the vision was a symbolic representation of the suffering of the Church in the 20th century, and that its focal point was the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. But for many, this explanation was a profound anticlimax. They refused to believe that a secret of such cosmic importance, kept hidden for 4 decades, was simply a prophecy of an event that had already passed. They accused the Vatican of releasing a decoy. The true secret, they insist, remains locked away, too terrible to reveal. The ultimate secret of Fatima, therefore, may be the story of a church that, by trying to manage a prophecy, created a controversy far greater than the prophecy itself, a wound of mistrust that, for some, has never healed. In the history of the papacy, there have been countless struggles against kings and emperors, but no single man ever challenged the temporal and spiritual power of the Church like Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a product of the French Revolution, a secular force of nature who saw religion not as a sacred truth, but as a political tool. The Vatican's secret archives contain the full, dramatic correspondence of this epic clash of wills, a paper trail that documents the ultimate collision between the ancient world of faith and the modern world of absolute state power. The dark secret revealed in these letters is not about a theological dispute. It is the story of a pope, Pius VII, being systematically outmaneuvered, humiliated, and ultimately imprisoned by a political genius who sought to make the Catholic Church a mere department of his imperial government. It was a battle that would permanently alter the relationship between the throne and the altar. When Napoleon seized power, the church in France was in ruins, shattered by the revolution's radical anti-clericalism. Churches had been desecrated, priests had been executed, and a new state-sponsored cult of reason had been tried and had failed. Napoleon, a pragmatist above all else, understood that to truly unify France, he needed to make peace with its Catholic soul. He needed the church to pacify the people and legitimize his rule, so he sought a treaty, a concordat, with Pope Pius VII. The negotiations, detailed in the diplomatic cables stored in the Vatican archives, were brutal. Napoleon held all the cards, and he knew it. He was not asking for the church's blessing, he was dictating terms. The Pope was forced to make staggering concessions. The church had to renounce all claims to the vast properties that had been seized during the revolution. Even more critically, the Concordat gave the French state the power to nominate bishops, who would then be formally invested by the Pope. The church in France was being brought to heel, its independence sacrificed for its very survival. The ultimate symbol of this new power dynamic came in the year 1804. Napoleon, having declared himself emperor, summoned the Pope to Paris for his coronation at Notre Dame Cathedral. Pope Pius VII made the long and arduous journey, believing his presence would signal a true reconciliation and a restoration of the Church's dignity. He was wrong. It was a calculated act of political theater, with the Pope as the star-supporting act. In a moment of breathtaking arrogance, as the Pope prepared to place the imperial crown on Napoleon's head, the Emperor took the crown from the Pope's hands, turned his back to the altar, and crowned himself. Then he crowned his wife, Josephine. The message, witnessed by all of Europe, was unmistakable. His power came not from God, not from the Church, but from himself and the will of the French people. The Pope was merely a prop. The letters in the archive from this period show a Pope deeply wounded by this public humiliation, his hopes for a partnership dashed. The relationship only deteriorated from there. When the Pope refused to join Napoleon's continental blockade against Great Britain, Napoleon annexed the Papal States, the lands in central Italy ruled by the popes for over 1,000 years. When Pius VII responded by excommunicating the emperor, Napoleon had him arrested. For nearly 5 years, the Vicar of Christ was Napoleon's prisoner, dragged from place to place in France, held in isolation, and relentlessly pressured to abdicate his temporal authority. The secret of the archives is the full story of this degradation, a raw account of the Church's near-total subjugation to a modern military dictator, a trauma that would shape Vatican policy for the next century. There is no document in the Vatican archives more fiercely debated, more controversial, and more morally fraught than the Reichskonkordat, the treaty signed between the Holy See and the German Reich in July of 1933. It was the first major international agreement signed by Adolf Hitler's new Nazi regime, and it conferred upon his government a desperately needed air of international legitimacy at a crucial moment in his consolidation of power. For decades, the question has haunted historians. Why did the Vatican, led by Pope Pius XI and his Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, the man who had become the wartime Pope Pius XII, make a deal with a regime whose ideology was so fundamentally anti-Christ, and whose thugs were already brutalizing priests and political opponents in the streets? The secret files of the negotiation do not reveal a Vatican sympathetic to Nazi ideology, but they do reveal a story of tragic miscalculation, cynical politics, and a fateful decision to sacrifice democratic opposition in a desperate gamble to protect the institutional church. In the early 1930s, Germany's powerful Catholic Centre Party was a bastion of democracy and a significant political obstacle to Hitler. German bishops had repeatedly warned their flock against the evils of National Socialism, but Cardinal Pacelli had a long-held goal: to secure a nationwide concordat with Germany to protect the Church's rights regarding schools, youth groups, and the freedom of worship. During the democratic Weimar Republic, he had been unable to achieve this. Paradoxically, the totalitarian dictator now offered him the very deal he had always wanted. Hitler's motives were purely cynical. He saw the Concordat as a way to neutralize political Catholicism in one swift move. By signing a treaty with the highest moral authority in the world, he could reassure anxious Germans and a suspicious international community that his intentions were peaceful. Most importantly, as part of the deal, he could demand the complete withdrawal of all clergy from politics, which would lead to the voluntary dissolution of the Centre Party, removing the last democratic blot from his path to absolute power. The dark secret contained in the archival correspondence is the Vatican side of this devil's bargain. Cardinal Pacelli and Pope Pius XI were not naive. They received numerous reports from Germany detailing the violence and lawlessness of the Nazi regime. They knew its ideology was poison, but they were driven by a deep-seated fear of communism and a belief that the structures of the church had to be preserved at all costs. They chose what they saw as a pragmatic path. They believed a treaty, a legally binding document, was the only shield that could protect Catholic institutions from the coming storm. The decision was made to trade political power for institutional survival. The Concordat was signed on July 20, 1933. Hitler hailed it as a great victory, declaring that it proved the Catholic Church had confidence in his new government. The Centre Party dissolved itself. The deal was done. And almost immediately, the Nazis began to violate it. Catholic newspapers were suppressed, Catholic youth groups were forcibly merged into the Hitler Youth, and priests were arrested. The archives are filled with the thousands of diplomatic notes the Vatican sent to Berlin over the next decade, meticulously documenting every violation. But these protests were futile. The treaty was worthless. The Vatican had gambled that it could secure the Church's freedom by signing a piece of paper with a regime that had no respect for the law. In doing so, it helped disarm a key source of political opposition at the moment it was needed most. Critics call it a catastrophic moral failure. Defenders argue it was a desperate attempt to save what could be saved in an impossible situation, and that the Concordat, however flawed, later gave the Church a legal basis to protest the regime's actions. The truth, revealed in the paper trail, is a grim story of a church facing a monstrous new form of politics and making a choice whose devastating consequences would echo through the darkest years of the 20th century. We arrive at the most painful, the most controversial, and the most heavily guarded secret in the modern history of the Vatican. It is a question that has echoed for more than 70 years, generating a mountain of books, bitter accusations, and staunch defenses. What did Pope Pius XII know about the Holocaust, and why did he not speak out? For decades, the debate raged in a vacuum of information, with critics decrying his silence as a moral failure and defenders insisting he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to save lives. Then, in March of 2020, the Vatican finally unsealed the archives of his pontificate. Millions of pages of letters, telegrams, and internal reports were opened to historians, offering the first real glimpse into the heart of the Holy See during the Second World War. The dark secret that has emerged from this ocean of paper is not a simple answer. It does not reveal a pro-Nazi pope, nor does it reveal an ignorant one. Instead, the Pius XII files paint a devastatingly clear picture of a pope who was among the best-informed men in the world about the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews, but who was paralyzed by a complex calculus of diplomacy, fear, and a fateful decision to prioritize the institution of the Church above all else. Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII in 1939, was no stranger to Germany. He had served as the papal nuncio, or ambassador, there for 12 years. He knew the language, he knew the culture, and he despised the godless paganism of Nazi ideology. From the very beginning of the war, his office became a clearinghouse for information. The newly opened files are filled with desperate pleas and detailed, horrifying reports that flowed into the Vatican from every corner of occupied Europe. Nuns reported watching Jewish children being rounded up and thrown into cattle cars. Bishops sent secret letters describing mass shootings in Poland and Ukraine. Jewish organizations pleaded with the Pope to issue a public condemnation. Allied governments, including the United States and Great Britain, provided the Vatican with intelligence confirming the existence of a continent-wide plan for the final solution. One report, sent to the Vatican in 1942 by a trusted source, explicitly detailed the use of gas chambers at Auschwitz. There is no longer any doubt. Pope Pius XII knew. He knew the scale, he knew the methods, and he knew it was happening in real time. So why did he remain publicly silent? The archives reveal the agonizing internal debates that consumed the Pope and his advisors. They were haunted by what had happened in the Netherlands. When Dutch bishops issued a public, forceful condemnation of the deportation of Jews, the Nazi response was swift and brutal. They retaliated by rounding up and murdering hundreds of Catholic converts from Judaism, including the future saint Edith Stein. This event became the Vatican's justification for its policy of caution. The Pope and his inner circle became convinced that a public protest would not stop Hitler but would only enrage him, triggering a violent backlash against both the remaining Jews and the millions of Catholics living under Nazi rule. This fear led the Pope to choose a different path: silent diplomacy and covert action. The archives detail countless back-channel efforts to obtain visas, to pressure Axis-aligned governments like Hungary and Slovakia to halt deportations, and to use the Church's vast network to save lives. Monasteries, convents, and even the Vatican itself were ordered to hide thousands of Jews, providing them with shelter, food, and false baptismal certificates. It is estimated that these efforts, directed by the Pope, saved tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives. It is a record of significant and heroic humanitarian aid. But this is the agonizing heart of the secret. The Pope chose to be a diplomat and a humanitarian aid director, but he refused to be a public prophet. He refused to use his unique moral authority to issue a clear, unambiguous public condemnation of the greatest crime in human history as it was happening. He never named the Nazis as the perpetrators, and he never named the Jews as the victims. The newly opened files show a man who received a letter from the chief rabbi of Rome, begging him for help as the Gestapo rounded up the city's Jews just outside the Vatican's walls, and who responded not with a public outcry but by ordering his clergy to open their doors. The secret of the Pius XII files is the story of this choice. It is the record of a pope who believed he was doing what was best, saving whom he could, while preserving his church. But it is also the record of a moral authority that chose caution over witness, a voice that so many were desperate to hear, but which never spoke the words that needed to be said. We have journeyed through 700 years of secrets. We have walked the halls of the Vatican archive, not as tourists but as investigators, following a trail of paper that reveals the hidden story of one of the world's oldest and most powerful institutions. From the political execution of the Knights Templar to the agonizing silence of the Holocaust, a single, unifying theme emerges. It is the story of an institution wrestling with its dual nature, its divine mission to guide souls, and its earthly role as a political state, a wielder of temporal power. The secrets we have explored are not theological mysteries. They are stories of power, the power to give divine sanction to the conquest of continents, the power to excommunicate a reformer and break Christendom in two, the power to crush a scientific truth in a vice of personal pride and bureaucratic process, the power to put a dead man on trial to settle a political score, the power to define truth itself by choosing which gospels would be read and which would be buried, the power to create a global controversy by withholding a prophecy, and the power to make devastating compromises with the most monstrous regimes of the modern age. Each document, whether it is a papal bull, a diplomatic cable, a trial transcript, or a secret letter, is a record of a choice between idealism and pragmatism, between moral witness and political survival, between condemning injustice and negotiating with it. The Vatican Secret and Apostolic Archives are the ultimate testament to the fact that history is not inevitable. It is made by human beings making human decisions, often under immense pressure and with consequences that echo for centuries. Today, the slow, deliberate process of opening these archives continues. It is a process that is in itself a part of this long history, a gradual, often reluctant admission that the legacy of paper and power belongs not just to the institution that created it, but to the world it helped to shape. The secrets of the Vatican are more than just fascinating stories from the past. They are cautionary tales about the profound and often perilous entanglement of faith and power, a legacy written on parchment and paper, sealed in wax, and now, finally, coming into the light.